There you are. Come in. Come in quickly out of the dark. The night is cold, but the library is always warm. Bolt the heavy oak door. That's right. The world outside cannot reach you here. You are safe. Take a deep, slow breath. The air inside is warm, filled with the scent of old paper and the sweet, smoky smell of the fireplace crackling in the great hall. The only light comes from the candles. See how they flicker on the tall, dark shelves. You are looking for a story. I know. Follow me. Down this narrow row, past the histories of sleeping kings, to a forgotten corner of the world. Here, we are looking for a very special tome tonight. Ah, this one. It is heavy, bound not in leather, but in a cover that feels like cool, cracked marble. It is heavy in my hands. There is no title, only a small, faded symbol of a crescent moon. Let us take it to the reading chair by the embers. Settle in, get comfortable, let the warmth soak into you. Listen. We open the ancient cover. A cloud of fine, silvery dust rises. Like mist on a long-lost morning, we blow it away, gently. The first chapter is called The Wonder at Ephesus. Let us read. But how? How could such a thing be? How could a home for a goddess, a monolith of pure white marble, rise from ground that yielded under your very own feet? The marsh did not just surround this place, it was this place. The air, thick and sweet with the smell of wet reeds and slow, silty water, was a constant reminder. You could feel the land breathing, a soft, damp exhalation that suggested nothing solid, nothing permanent could ever truly rest here. To build here was not just ambitious, it was a defiance of the earth itself. Pliny's words echoed in your mind. The riddle of the soft ground, the treacherous shifting land that seemed poised to swallow whole any monument foolish enough to trust it. And yet the temple stood, or rather, it would stand for 1,000 years, held aloft not by brute force but by a secret. A whisper of profound genius. This was the puzzle presented to the architect, Chersiphron of Knossos. A mind not of hard edges, but of subtle understanding. He must have walked this very ground as you do now, feeling the cool, wet air cling to his skin, smelling the sharp greenness of the crushed reeds under his sandals. He would have felt the squish of the earth, the slow, hungry pull of the mud. Where others saw an enemy to be conquered, to be piled high with stone until it surrendered, Chersiphron saw a partner. He knew you could not defeat the marsh. You could not command the water to retreat or the soil to harden. To do so would be to invite the inevitable, creeping revenge of nature. The earth would shift, the water would rise, and the perfect marble columns would crack, toppling into the mud. No, He understood. The foundation could not resist the earth. It had to join it. It needed to float. It needed to breathe. It required a cushion, a soft, forgiving bed that could absorb the land's quiet movements, that could drink its dampness, and that could gently cradle the impossible weight of a goddess's home. The solution was not one of stone, but of ash and wool, a secret spoken between the architect and the swamp. First they dug. They carved great, yawning trenches into the wet, dark earth, not impossibly deep, but wide like the outline of a sleeping giant. The sound must have been a soft, wet thud and suck, as shovels of bronze and iron sliced into the saturated soil. The smell of the earth, freshly opened, would have been overwhelming, a potent primal smell of decay and life, of minerals and millennia. Into these dark, watery wounds they poured the first part of the secret. Charcoal. Imagine wagons, hundreds of them, creaking under the weight of it. Not logs, but the dry, black skeletons of trees. The air would have filled with a fine, acrid dust, a dry, smoky scent that cut through the Marsh's damp perfume. They poured it in, a river of blackness, filling the trenches foot by foot. You can almost hear the sound, a dry, rattling hiss as the porous charcoal met the wet soil. This was the temple's lung. The charcoal, thirsty and light, began to drink. It drew the seeping water into its countless tiny hollows, wicking the moisture away from the surface, stabilizing the saturated mud. It was a dry bed in a wet world. It did not fight the water. It tamed it, invited it in, and held it fast, creating a vast subterranean sponge that was both firm and forgiving. But a sponge alone was not enough. The earth here did not just seep, it trembled. This was a land of quiet, hidden shifts, a place where the ground could shudder, sigh, and settle. The temple needed more than a lung. It needed a joint. It needed a layer that could absorb the shock. And so, upon the endless bed of black charcoal, they laid the fleece. This was not the clean white wool of a spun thread. This was raw. This was fleece, thick and heavy with the natural grease of the sheep, the lanolin still clinging to every fibre. Imagine the smell, the pungent animal warmth of 1,000 unwashed flocks, a surprisingly earthy, almost alive scent, blending with the acrid charcoal and the damp reeds. They brought it in great, sprawling mounds, and workers packed it down, layer upon layer, tamping the springy, greasy wool into a dense, thick mattress. It must have felt impossibly soft, a strange, organic blanket tucked into the earth. This was the genius of Chersiphron. This was the secret. The fleece, packed tight, slick with its own natural oils, was water-resistant. It would not rot in the dampness held by the charcoal below. But more than that, it was a cushion. It was a vast, buried shock absorber. When the earth moved, when a tremor passed through the ground like a ripple in a pond, the fleece would compress. It would absorb the vibration, dissipating the energy before it could reach the stone above it, allowed the temple to float on the marsh. Only then, only upon this bizarre and perfect bed of burned wood and raw wool did they lay the first stones. The massive, cold and heavy blocks of the foundation. They were lowered with ropes and pulleys, the teams of workers holding their breath, listening, and they did not sink, they did not tilt. They settled, they rested. The black charcoal drank the wetness, the thick fleece cushioned the weight, and the soft earth, respected and understood, held the temple aloft. Standing here, at the edge of the excavation, you can almost feel that foundation beneath your feet. Not a rigid, brittle thing, but something yielding, breathing, a living partnership between the architect's mind and the ancient whispering marsh. The genius was not in the stone you would later see. It was in the unseen, in the soft, dark secret hidden below, the secret of charcoal and fleece. But before the first stone could be laid upon that soft, dark bed, before the genius of the earth could meet the ambition of the architect, a different kind of power was needed. For marble, even resting on wool, is not free. Genius must be fed, and this temple, this home for Artemis, was not to be a humble shrine, it was to be a wonder. It required a treasure so vast it beggared the imagination. It required a river of gold, and that river flowed from a single source, from a man whose very name would become a whisper for wealth itself, spoken for millennia after his kingdom had turned to dust. Croesus, king of Lydia. To understand the temple, you must first understand this man. You must transport yourself from the damp, reedy air of the Ephesian marsh, eastward, inland, to the dry, sun-baked plains of Anatolia, to his capital, Sardis. Here the air does not cling. It is sharp and clear. It smells of dust, of hot stone, and the faint, sweet scent of cedar wood burning in braziers. It is a land of hard edges and brilliant light, and through this land, through the very heart of his city, flowed a river, the Pactolus. The Pactolus. The Pactolus. With gold, not in great, crude nuggets, but as a fine, glittering dust, a shimmer in the water, as if the sun itself were dissolving into the stream. Imagine standing by its banks, the sound of the water a gentle shush over the pebbles. You dip your hand into the cool current, and when you pull it back, your skin is dusted with a fine golden powder, glittering in the sharp Lydian sun. This was the source of his power, a magic, relentless golden silt, harvested with greasy wool fleeces, staked in the riverbed, the same humble material that would one day cushion the goddess's floor. The world's wealth simply washed up at his feet, day after day, year after year. But Croesus was more than just a man who was lucky enough to be born by a golden stream. Others had been rich. Croesus invented riches. He was the first, it is said, to take that raw, natural glitter, that soft, heavy dust, and give it a promise. He refined it. He separated the gold from the silver, the pale natural alloy they called electrum, and he struck them into discs. Coins. The first true standardized, pure, gold and silver currency the world had ever seen. Can you imagine the feel of one, the sheer, dense weight of it in your palm? Not a rough nugget, but a smooth, warm circle of pure metal, stamped with the image of a lion and a bull, the symbols of his power. It was no longer just metal. It was an idea. It was a king's word, made heavy and real. This small, warm object could be traded for anything, for a life supply of grain, for a ship, for a block of marble the size of a house. The sound of his wealth was not the dragon's hoard, a dead pile in a dark room. It was a clinking, a jingling, a movement. It was the sound of trade, of power in motion. His palace at Sardis must have felt like the center of the world, the floors, polished stone, cool beneath your feet, the walls hung with heavy, intricate tapestries from Babylon, their woven threads smelling faintly of spice and wool, the air thick with the scent of expensive incense, a smoky, sweet perfume designed to soothe and to awe, and Croesus himself seated on a throne of carved ivory, draped in robes of the deepest, rarest purple, a colour so precious it was worth more than its weight in his own gold. He was, perhaps, the first man to ever truly believe that money could solve anything, that it could buy happiness, that it could buy safety, and that is the secret of the man. Beneath the gold, beneath the robes, beneath the power that could move mountains, was a deep and profound vulnerability. He was, like all men, afraid of the future, afraid of loss, afraid of the gods. He famously consulted the great oracle at Delphi, desperate for a whisper of reassurance, a sign that his golden world would last forever. He stood at the absolute pinnacle of human power, the wealthiest man alive, and yet he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, just as surely as the Marsh at Ephesus. He saw this new temple, this audacious plan by the genius Chersophron, not just as a project, but as a necessity. It was a transaction. It was a plea. It was a magnificent, desperate hedge against the darkness he felt creeping at the edges of his vision. He could not build a monument to his own power. That would be hubris, and the gods were quick to punish hubris. But he could build a home for her, for Artemis, the goddess of this wild, marshy land. He could pour his uncountable wealth into her house. He would give her a home so splendid, so vast, so blindingly white and perfect that she could not possibly refuse his devotion. He would pave her floors and raise her columns. He would use his gold, his manufactured idea of wealth, to purchase the one thing his river of gold could not guarantee, the favor of the immortal. And so the gold of the Pactolus began to flow west from the dry, dusty throne room of Sardis down to the damp, whispering port of Ephesus. It flowed in wagons, in heavy, clinking chests, each one bearing the lion and the bull. It was the fuel for the impossible. The King of Gold had found a hole in the earth, a soft, damp place, and he had decided to fill it with his fear, with his hope, and with a tide of wealth so great it would stun the world into silence. He would build the goddess a mountain of marble, and in doing so, perhaps he could build a fortress for his own fragile heart. You pass from the sunlight of the Temenos, and the world changes. It is not a change of light and shadow, not at first. It is a change in the air, the breeze that skimmed across the open courtyard, carrying the distant briny smell of the sea and the green scent of the marsh, suddenly gone, hushed. The air in here is still. It is cool, with a profound cellar-like chill that feels ancient, as if the sun has never truly touched the stone floor beneath your feet. The air smells different. It smells of clean, cold marble, a scent like dry, powdered minerals, and beneath that, the faintest, lingering sweetness of incense, a ghost of sandalwood and myrrh clinging to the stone. You take 3, 4, perhaps 5 steps forward, and then you are forced to stop. Your body simply ceases to move, overwhelmed, because you are now standing at the base of one, just one. You cannot even call it a column, not really. The word is too small. It is a pillar, a tower, a sheer white cliff of polished marble that rises from the floor and disappears into the shadows of the ceiling, so very, very far above. It is 60 feet high. Imagine a building 6 stories tall, made of a single seamless piece of white. And there are 127 of them. You reach out a hesitant hand. Your fingers, so warm and small and alive, touch the surface. The stone is not just cool, it is cold. A deep, permanent cold that seems to drink the heat from your very skin. And it is smooth, impossibly liquidly smooth, polished by hands, by time, by devotion, until it feels less like stone and more like ice or glass. You run your palm across it, feeling the tiny, perfect vertical ridges of the fluting, channels carved deep enough to lay your arm in. Your gaze travels down. Even the base is taller than you are. It is not a simple pedestal. It is a world of its own, a drum of marble carved with figures, gods and mortals and heroes, each one the size of a living man, their stone robes seeming to flow and ripple. They are frozen in a silent, eternal procession around the base of this giant. You are an ant crawling past a carving of an ant, and then you make the mistake of looking up. Your head tilts back and further back still, until your neck strains and a feeling of gentle vertigo, a dizzying, floating sensation takes hold. The fluted lines rush upwards, soaring, pulling your eye with them, faster and faster until they converge in the gloom. The capital high above, a delicate scrolled thing of impossible, intricate grace, seems as small as your hand from here, lost in the deep, profound shadows of the ceiling. You feel as if you might simply fall upwards, drawn into the immense soaring void. This is the feeling of scale, the feeling of being dwarfed, and this is only one. You tear your gaze away, stumbling forward, and the true nature of the place finally, terrifyingly, reveals itself. This is not a room. This is not a hall. This is a forest of pure white stone. Everywhere you look, in every direction, the view is the same. An endless, rhythmic, hypnotic repetition of white giants. They are arranged in a double row, a dipteral plan, meaning you are not just walking past them, you are walking through them. They surround you. An aisle of stone, then another, then another. They create a maze of impossible geometry. The light, falling from the open sky far, far above, does not illuminate this place. It stripes it. It streams down in great, bright, silvery shafts, striking the polished floor and exploding in a soft white glare. And between these shafts of light are canyons of cool, deep, blue-grey shadow. You walk forward, and your own small footsteps, so clear on the hard pavement, are the only sound. They echo, tap, tap, tap. Each sound seems tiny, impossibly brief, swallowed by the sheer volume of the space. A cough would be a crack of thunder, a spoken word would be lost, a tiny ripple in an ocean of silence. The only other sound is a low, faint, resonant sigh. It is the sound of the air, the wind, moving far, far above you, catching the high, unseen edges of the roof. It is the sound of the temple breathing. You are small. This is the purpose. You are a mote of dust, floating in a sunbeam in a giant's house. You are a child who has wandered into a grove of impossible ancient trees. The sheer, crushing, beautiful weight of the marble above you, the endless perspective of the columns receding into the distance, it all works to recalibrate your very soul. Your own troubles, your own fears, your own sighs, it all shrinks. It becomes insignificant. This is a place designed to empty you, to make you quiet, to make you listen. You feel a strange sense of peace in this smallness. There is no threat here. You are not crushed. You are held. You are sheltered inside something so vast, so permanent, and so much greater than yourself that you can finally, for a moment, let go. You can simply be a tiny, breathing, warm thing walking in the cool, silent, white forest of a goddess. But the forest of stone, vast and endless as it seems, is not the destination. It is the path. It is the great, humbling journey you must take before you can even glimpse the heart. As you walk deeper into the temple, past the double rows of soaring white giants, the light begins to change. The brilliant silvery shafts of sun striking the floor become fewer. Shadows grow longer, deeper, until they begin to merge, swallowing the blue-grey coolness of the marble into a soft, encroaching gloom. The rhythmic tap-tap of your footsteps, which echoed so clearly in the open forest, begins to dampen. The sound becomes softer, lower, thud, thud, as if the very air is growing thicker, heavier, pressing in on you, absorbing the sound. You are approaching the naos, the inner chamber, the Holy of Holies. There is no great guarded gate, no towering bronze door barred and locked. There is only a doorway, darker than the shadows that surround it, an opening in a wall of stone so massive it seems to be a part of the earth itself. But this threshold is more powerful than any lock. It is a boundary of feeling. You can feel the air changing before you even reach it. The cool mineral scent of the marble forest stops, as if hitting an invisible wall, and from the darkness beyond, a new scent rolls out to meet you, a thick, almost tangible perfume. You pause at the threshold, your eyes straining to see into the deep, warm dark. The air that touches your face is not the cool, clean air of the columns. This air is still, it is heavy, and it is warm. It carries the scent that was only a faint ghost before, but is now a powerful, intoxicating presence. It is the smell of a fire that has never been allowed to die. The sharp, sweet, resinous sting of incense, a dense cloud of sandalwood, and a rich, smoky perfume that stings your eyes and coats the back of your throat. You take a single, hesitant step across the stone line, and the world ends. The vast, echoing emptiness of the forest is gone. Instantly, the silence here is not empty. It is full. It is a heavy velvet blanket that muffles everything. Your own breathing suddenly sounds impossibly loud, a harsh, ragged intrusion. The air is so thick with the smoke of centuries of offerings that you can almost see it, swirling in slow, heavy eddies in the faint, flickering light. It is dark, a deep, profound, sacred darkness. The only light comes from low, burning lamps, small points of gold flickering from bronze stands, and perhaps a single great ancient Thymiatarian, an incense burner, glowing a dull, smoky red in the centre of the room. The light does not illuminate, it suggests. It catches the edge of a polished stone floor. It glints off something golden far in the gloom. It creates vast, dancing shadows that seem to be alive, clinging to the walls, merging with the ceiling, which is now lost in an impenetrable, smoky blackness. You have passed the boundary. You are in a place where the sun does not exist, a place where the only air is the breath of the cult. You feel the weight of who is allowed here, not the tourist, not the citizen, not the curious traveller, only the megabasoi, the priests, only the vestals, the priestesses, only those who have dedicated their entire lives to this service, their feet bare on this same smooth, cold floor, their lungs filled with this same sacred, choking smoke. You feel the crushing weight of their exclusion. You are an intruder. Your very presence here is a violation, a whisper in a place of profound, ancient and guarded silence. The air itself feels charged, as if it is listening, as if the stones are watching. This is not a house for the public. This is a private inner chamber. This is a womb, dark and warm and close. And in the deepest part of that warm, smoky darkness, lit by the flickering, uncertain glow of the lamps, you can just make out a shape. It is tall, taller than a man. It is a dark, still, utterly silent form, standing against the far wall. It is the heart of the darkness, the secret that all this, the marsh, the foundation, the gold, the forest of marble, was built to protect. You are in its presence now, and the air is alive with it. This temple, this house of the goddess, was more than a monument of marble and gold. It was a power, a living, breathing law that existed outside the laws of men. The Roman proconsul, with his legions and his lictors, ruled the city of Ephesus. His guards, in their leather and bronze, patrolled the stone streets. Their justice was swift and hard and absolute, but their power stopped at an invisible line, a line marked not by a fortress wall or a moat or a phalanx of spears, but by a simple, sun-baked stone, a parabolus marker, a boundary stone. Imagine walking the perimeter of the vast sacred district, the Temenos. You would find these markers set deep in the earth. Perhaps you run your hand over one. The stone is warm, gritty with the dust of the Anatolian plain. It is carved simply with the symbol of the goddess, the honey bee, or perhaps just a few stark Greek letters declaring the land hers. And as you stand there, 1 foot on the dusty public road, 1 foot on the sacred soil, you are standing on the very precipice of power. On one side, the law of man. On the other, Asylum, the law of sanctuary. This was the temple's greatest gift, a promise, absolute and unbreakable, that whoever crossed that line, whatever their crime, whatever their past, they were safe. They were under the personal, divine protection of Artemis herself. To lay a hand on them, to drag them back across that invisible line, was not just a crime against Ephesus, it was a sacrilege against the goddess. And that was a crime no soldier, no bounty hunter, no furious master was willing to commit. Let us imagine him. We do not know his name. He is perhaps a slave from a villa in the hills, his body broken by the quarries, his spirit broken by the whip. But one night, something snaps. He runs. He runs in the darkness. The sounds of the night, the chirp of the cicada, the distant howl of a wolf, amplified by his own terror. His lungs are on fire. His breath is a raw, tearing gasp in his throat. His feet, bare, are cut and bleeding on the sharp stones of the road. He can smell his own fear, a sharp, coppery scent of sweat and panic. Behind him he hears them. He has heard them for hours. The rhythmic baying cry of the dogs and the distant shouts of the slave catchers. He stumbles, falls, his hands scraping against the hard, dry earth. He can smell the crushed wild thyme beneath him. He has no strength left. He is ready to be caught, to be dragged back to the agonizing certain death that awaits him. He pushes himself up one last time, his muscles screaming, and he sees it. It is not the wonder you have seen. He does not see the soaring columns or the genius of the foundation. He sees a pale white ghost against the pre-dawn sky, a shape of impossible size, a hope. The shouting is closer now. They have seen him. He is exposed, a tiny dark figure moving across the open ground that leads to the Temenos. He uses the last of his life, a desperate, sobbing run. His heart is a frantic bird trapped in his ribs, beating thump, thump, thump. He sees the stone, the boundary marker. It is just a stone. It is not a gate. It is not a wall. He throws himself forward, a last collapsing lurch. His hand, caked in dirt and his own drying blood, slams against the smooth, cool marble of the marker. He falls past it, tumbling onto the sacred ground, his cheek pressed against the earth. And silence. The baying of the dog stops. The shouting ceases. He hears a skid in the dust just feet behind him. He hears the heavy, ragged breathing of his pursuers. He forces his head to turn. They are there. 2 men, their faces dark with fury in the growing light. The dog strains at its leash, whining, its hot breath fogging in the cool morning air. They are close enough to touch, but they do not move. They stand frozen on the other side of that invisible, terrible line. Their hands grip their weapons, but they do not draw them. They look at him, this broken, worthless thing, and they look at the temple, now beginning to glow a soft, rosy pink in the first light of the sun, and they are afraid. They are consumed by a terror far greater than his own, a divine terror. He has touched the stone. He belongs to her now. He lies there, gasping, the smell of the dusty road mingling with the first faint, sweet whisper of incense drifting from the great altar far within. He closes his eyes. He is, for the first time in his life, utterly and completely safe. This power, this Asylum, was not only a shield for the desperate, it was a vault for the wealthy, for the same divine terror that stopped the slave catcher at the boundary line, also stopped the thief. The Temple of Artemis was the safest bank in the ancient world. Imagine yourself as a different person, a merchant. Your ship has just returned from Egypt, its hold full of linen and papyrus. You have sold your cargo in the bustling Ephesian agora, and you now possess a weight that is its own burden. A heavy wooden chest, bound in iron, filled with gold and silver coins, or perhaps a bag of priceless cut gems. Where do you keep it? The locks on the inn doors are flimsy. The city guard can be bribed. To bury it is to risk forgetting or being watched. So you bring it here. You and your servants heave the cold, heavy chest through the great forest of columns, your footsteps echoing in the vast, cool silence. The air smells of marble and old, faint incense. You are met not by a guard, but by a priest, a megabizos. His face is calm, his eyes unreadable. You are taken not to the dark, holy naos, but to a different chamber, a treasury, a vault built deep into the massive stone foundations of the temple. The air here is cold, dead still. It smells of old metal, of dry, ancient wood, and of the earth itself. You place your chest upon a stone shelf, next to a chest from a Lydian lord, and a bag of pearls from a Persian satrap. The priest does not give you a key. He gives you a small baked clay token, stamped with the seal of the goddess. That is your receipt. You walk back out into the light, your hands now empty, your shoulders light. The chest is unguarded. There is no soldier at the door, there is no lock, there is no need. Because who would dare, who would be so suicidally mad as to steal from Artemis, to put their human hands on the property of the goddess? The punishment would not be a trial or a prison. It would be a divine, creeping, and inescapable curse. It would be sickness. It would be madness. It would be the ruin of your family for 1,000 generations. The fear of the goddess was the strongest vault ever built. And so, at that same sun-warmed boundary stone, two worlds met. The runaway slave with nothing came to save his life. The wealthy merchant with everything came to save his fortune. And both, in their own way, found refuge, held fast in the silent, unblinking, and merciful gaze of the goddess. It was a night in the deepest, driest part of summer, the 21st of July, in the year 356 before the birth of the Christ. The air over Ephesus was heavy and hot and still. A thick, dark velvet blanket draped over the sleeping city. The moon perhaps was a thin silver crescent offering almost no light. The only sound was the endless, dry, rhythmic chirp of the cicadas in the parched hills, a sound like 1,000 tiny shaking rattles. Down in the Temenos, the great white temple was a ghost of itself. It was not a building. It was a pale, sleeping mountain, breathing in the cool, faint scent of the distant marsh, its marble skin almost glowing, soaking up the faint silver starlight. Inside the vast, silent forest of columns, the darkness was absolute. The air was cool, still bearing the faint, cold, mineral scent of the stone. The goddess in her inner sanctum was wrapped in a darkness so profound it felt like the beginning of the world. All was quiet, all was safe. But a man was walking in that darkness. He was not a priest. He was not a guardian. He was not a runaway slave or a wealthy merchant. He was nothing, a shadow, a man whose name, Herostratus, meant nothing to anyone. He walked the dusty streets of Ephesus, and he was invisible. He saw the great ships in the harbour, the wealthy citizens in their fine dyed robes, the artists and the philosophers, and he saw the temple, this wonder of the world, a name that was on the lips of every traveller, every king, every historian. The temple had a name, it had a life. It would be remembered forever. And he would not. This was his motive. There was no gold in his pocket. There was no political agenda in his heart. There was only a cold, hollow, echoing emptiness, a desperate, gnawing, screaming need to not be forgotten, a sickness of the soul. He knew he could never build anything that would last. He could not paint, or sculpt, or write, but he knew with a terrible, simple, brilliant clarity that he could destroy. He had a torch, and he had a small skin of oil. Perhaps he stood for a moment in the great, silent forest of columns, feeling the impossible, cool smoothness of the marble against his small, warm, sweating hand. Perhaps he even felt a moment of doubt, a shiver of awe, of fear at the sheer, beautiful, sleeping power of the place. But the sickness was stronger, the need was greater. He set his fire at the heart of it all, at the great, carved cedar wood roof beams. The smell at first would have been almost pleasant. The sharp, resinous snap of the ancient dry wood catching flame, a scent like a giant's campfire, a single small orange flower of light blooming in the immense, perfect darkness, a crackle, a pop. But cedar is a hungry wood, and the beams were old and vast and dry as bone. The small flower became a river. It ran along the carvings. It licked up the beams. It found the rafters. And within minutes, the temple woke up. A low groan echoed through the stone forest, a sound like a sleeping giant turning in its bed. It was the sound of the roof, a space larger than a field, beginning to twist in the sudden, impossible heat. The small crackle became a roar, a living, breathing, hungry sound that filled the vast emptiness. The heat was unimaginable. It struck the cold white marble of the 127 columns, and the marble screamed. It was not a sound a human throat could make. It was a sharp, terrible, deafening crack, the sound of a mountain splitting apart. The columns, 60 feet of solid, perfect stone, began to fracture. They wept superheated steam. They began to shear, to split, as the cold, ancient stone was violated by a heat it was never meant to feel. The city was awake now. Shouts, cries of disbelief, people flooding into the streets, their faces pale and horrified, lit by a new, terrible orange sun that had risen in the middle of the night. The temple was no longer a pale ghost. It was a torch. It was a volcano of fire, a column of swirling black oily smoke and incandescent sparks that rose thousands of feet into the sky, blotting out the stars. And then the final sound. The beams consumed finally gave way, with a sound that was not a sound but a concussion, a vast earth-shaking whoomp that knocked people from their feet a mile away. The entire roof collapsed. It fell into the temple, into the forest of stone, in a tidal wave of fire. It was a waterfall of burning timbers, a river of molten lead and melted bronze crashing down onto the marble floor. The remaining columns, their tops now gone, stood like broken, jagged teeth, silhouetted against an inferno. The goddess, in her dark inner sanctum, was gone. Her ancient wooden body, her strange multi-breasted form, her enigmatic smile, was just ash. The heat was so intense it would have melted the gold and silver offerings, the coins in the treasury, turning the safest bank in the world into a flowing metallic river of ruin. By dawn, it was over. What was left was a wound, a smoking, black, gaping hole in the earth, surrounded by a ring of shattered, blackened, pitifully broken stumps. The air, for miles, stank of wet ash, of quenched fire, of death. The grief of the Ephesians was absolute. It was the grief of a child who has watched their mother murdered, and when they found him, Herostratus, he was not hiding. He was perhaps simply watching, his face lit by the glow of his own terrible immortality. He confessed, he bragged. The Ephesians, in their fury, devised a punishment they believed was worse than any death. They would give him what he did not want. They would give him oblivion. They passed a decree, the damnatio memoriae. It was forbidden, on pain of death, to ever speak his name, to write it, to carve it. He was to be erased from time. His name was to be scraped from the stone, washed from the parchment. He was to be unhappened. But you cannot forbid a whisper. The very act of forbidding the name was the thing that saved it. The name Herostratus became a secret, a dark, horrified whisper that travelled from merchant to merchant, from historian to historian. Do you know who did this? You must never say his name, but it was Herostratus. The forbidden whisper was louder, more permanent than any carved monument. He had won. And as the smoke, thick and acrid, drifted from the ruins of the Artemision, it was carried on the summer winds eastward across the Aegean Sea. On that very same night, as the goddess's house was dying, a new power was being born. The chroniclers later would whisper about this. They would say that Artemis, the goddess of childbirth, could not save her own home. She was, they said, too busy, because on that same night, in a palace in Macedon, a queen named Olympias was in labour, and as the temple in Ephesus turned to ash, she gave birth to a son, a boy who would one day redraw the entire map of the known world, a boy named Alexander. One wonder of the world burned, and on the same night, under the same smoke-choked stars, another was just drawing his first breath. The fire had cooled. The night of horror had passed, and the years too had begun to pass, but the wound remained. The great temple, the wonder of the world, was a scar, a field of blackened, shattered, broken stumps, open to the sky, weeping black rain when the storms came. The air, once so clean and cool with the scent of marble, now carried a permanent, faint, acrid tang of old ash and charcoal. The grief of Ephesus had settled like the soot into a dull, quiet ache. The goddess was homeless, and then he came. He did not arrive as a pilgrim, with soft feet and a quiet prayer. He arrived as a storm, a living, breathing, human thunderstorm. Alexander, the Macedonian, the new master of the world. He was so very young, not a king of soft gold and hidden fears, but a man of sun-scorched bronze and dust and speed. The city of Ephesus did not hear him approach. It felt him, a vibration in the earth, a low, continuous rumble that was not thunder, but the sound of thousands of men, the thud of the phalanx marching, the creak of leather, the clink of harness, the heavy rhythmic snort of 1,000 war horses. The air he brought with him was not the soft, salty, damp breath of the Ephesian marsh. It was the air of the inland, of the high, dry plains. It smelled of dust. It smelled of hot metal. It smelled of leather and horse and the sharp, coppery, alive scent of 10,000 men and their sweat. The city held its breath. The conqueror of Persia, the new Pharaoh of Egypt, the man who had humbled the East, was riding through their gates, and he rode, as was his way, directly to the heart of the city, to the goddess. He came to stand, as you might, at the edge of the great, gaping, blackened ruin. Imagine him there, his soldiers, his hetairoi, his companions standing silent behind him. The wind, the only thing in Ephesus that did not fear him, would have whistled softly through the broken, jagged teeth of the remaining columns. It would have stirred the fine grey ash on the ground, lifting it in small, sad, dancing spirals. It would have tugged at his cloak. He stood there looking at the devastation, at the profound, empty, wounded silence of the place. And he did not see a ruin. He saw a void. He saw a canvas. Alexander, more than any man who had ever lived, hated a void. He was a man driven by pathos, by a relentless, divine longing to fill every empty space in the world with his own name, his own glory. He turned to the priests and the magistrates of Ephesus, who stood nearby, their hands perhaps trembling in the folds of their robes, and he made his offer. His voice would have been clear and strong, a voice made to be heard over the sound of battle. He would rebuild it, not as it was, better. He would pour the captured, plundered wealth of the Persian Empire into this hole. The gold of Susa, the silver of Babylon, a treasure that would make the gifts of Croesus look like the contents of a child's purse. He would raise the 127 columns again, each one a perfect, seamless, gleaming white giant. He would roof it in the finest cedar, carved by the greatest artists of his new, vast, emerging empire. He would restore the goddess to her home. He would make the wonder wondrous again. A pin dropped on the stone would have echoed. The priests must have felt a sudden, dizzying wave of hope, followed by a cold, sharp spike of fear, because they knew the way of kings, they knew the way of this king. There was, of course, a price. It was not a price in money or in land or in slaves. It was a price in one small, simple thing, his name. He wanted his name, Alexandros, carved into the architrave. He wanted it etched into the stone for all of time. He wanted every pilgrim who sailed into the harbour, every merchant, every traveller, every king who came after him, to look up at this, the greatest building in the world, and to see his name. He would not be a patron like Croesus, his name hidden on the base of a column. He would be the creator. He would attach his own mortal, burning, ambitious name forever to the immortal, divine, and silent goddess. And the priests were trapped. You must imagine the meeting, the desperate whispered counsel, the air in the chamber thick and still, the smell of nervous sweat, barely masked by the heavy, sweet, frantic burning of incense in a bronze tripod. You cannot say no to Alexander. You cannot say no to the man who holds the world in his mailed fist. To refuse him is to risk the end of your city. It is to risk his famous, terrible, swift-moving wrath. But you cannot say yes. You cannot. This is the Artemision. This is the house of Artemis Ephesia. She is not a Greek goddess to be bartered with. She is an ancient Anatolian power, a mother of the earth. Her dark, mysterious, multi-breasted idol, a secret that belongs only to this land. To put a man's name on her home, even this man, is a sacrilege. It is a betrayal. It is a pollution of the sacred. They were caught between the thunderbolt and the abyss, and then it came. A whisper, a perfect, brilliant, subtle piece of diplomacy, born of pure, terrified genius. We do not know which priest, which magistrate was chosen to deliver the message. But imagine him standing before the young, impatient, sunlit conqueror. The air is still. The world is waiting. The Ephesian bows low, his hands hidden, and he speaks the words softly, humbly. It is not fitting, a pause, for one God to build a temple for another. Let those words just hang in the air. Feel the sheer, beautiful, shimmering genius of them. It is not a refusal. It is flattery. It is the most profound compliment Alexander has, perhaps, ever received. They are not saying no. They are saying, "You are correct, great Alexander. You are not a man. You are not a king. You are a god. We see it. We acknowledge it." And gods are peers. They are equals. A mortal like Croesus builds a temple for a god as a gift, as an offering, as a prayer upwards. But one god does not build a temple for another. It is not fitting. It would imply one was greater, one was lesser. It would be a breach of cosmic protocol. They had taken his own colossal divine ego, the very thing that drove him to make the offer, and they had used it as a shield against him. How could he argue? To argue, he would have to say, "But I am not a god." And that That was the one thing he would never, ever say. We are told that Alexander was charmed, that he smiled, he had been seen, he had been understood, and he had been, with the most polite, delicate whisper, utterly and completely denied. The offer was withdrawn. The young god, satisfied, turned his attention to other newer cities that would bear his name, and the Ephesians, their city safe, their goddess's honour intact, let out a single, slow, quiet, collective breath, the sound of a city that had just survived the impossible. They would rebuild their temple, but they would do it themselves. And so the young god, the young king, Alexander, turned his gaze eastward toward the heat of Persia, toward the deserts of India, chasing his own divine, restless longing. He left Ephesus in his wake, a city he had charmed, and a city that had, with a whispered, silken word, charmed him. He left them alone, alone with their grief, alone with their homeless goddess, alone with the great black, smoking, jagged-toothed wound in the heart of their land. For a time there must have been only silence, the silence of the ruin, the sound of the wind whistling its low, mournful, reedy song through the broken stumps of marble. The air, even after years, would have carried that sour, acrid, unmistakable scent of old fire, a cold, wet ash smell that clung to everything, a permanent reminder of the night of the torch. But the Ephesians had refused a god. They had refused the conqueror of the world. They had done so to protect their goddess. And now, in that proud, aching silence, a new feeling began to grow. Not grief, but resolve. A quiet, fierce, unbending determination that burned hotter than any fire. They would not just rebuild. That was not enough. To simply replace what was lost. That would be to admit that Herostratus, the forbidden name, had won, that he had, for a time, defeated them. No, to rebuild was to repair. They would do more. They would erase. They would build a monument so vast, so blindingly, impossibly magnificent, that the memory of the first burned temple would become nothing but a footnote, a shadow, a story you told your children before showing them the real wonder. The work began, not with a crash, but with a whisper, the whisper of planning. The greatest architects of the age, men like Paeonius, who had worked on the great temple of Apollo at Didyma, were called. They bent over vast, pale sheets of parchment, their hands tracing new lines in charcoal. The scent of the ruin was slowly, gently replaced by the scent of the workshop, the dry, papery smell of the scrolls, the sharp, clean scent of shaved wood. And their plan was one of pure, defiant, glorious excess. It would be bigger. The first temple was vast. This one would be colossal. The very footprint, the stylobate, the stone platform on which the columns would stand, was expanded. Imagine standing at the edge of the new foundation. It was now 425 feet long, 225 feet wide, a field, a solid, sprawling, man-made plateau of the finest, whitest marble, laid over the same dark, breathing secret of the charcoal and the fleece. And then the sound that had been absent for so long, the sound of creation. It did not return all at once. It returned as a distant, hopeful tap, tap, tap from the quarries in the hills, the sound of the chisel, the sharp, clean clink of iron on stone, and slowly, day by day, year by year, that sound grew. It became a symphony, 1,000 men working. The air of Ephesus, once choked with ash, now filled with a new, fine white dust, a dry mineral powder that coated your tongue, that settled on your robes. It was the scent of the mountain being brought piece by piece into the city. They did not just raise 127 columns, they raised them taller. The new columns would soar over 60 feet into the air, and they were not just plain, fluted giants. Oh no! The Ephesians had learned from Croesus. They had learned from their own pride. The lower drums of the columns, the very bases, were no longer just pedestals. They were stages. Each one, taller than a man, was carved with life-sized figures, a breathtaking, staggering display of sculpture. Gods and heroes and myths wrapped around the base of every single soaring pillar. To walk among them was no longer to walk in a simple forest. It was to walk through a silent, white, frozen crowd of the divine. Imagine the smell of the work, the scent of the new wood, not the memory of burnt cedar, but the sharp, sappy green smell of fresh-cut cypress and cedar, brought in massive, rough-hewn beams from the forest of Lebanon. The smell of the ropes, a dry, grassy, hempen smell, thick as a man's arm, straining under the impossible weight of the marble drums. The air was filled with the scent of effort, of human sweat, of hot oiled bronze axles groaning in their wooden pulley blocks. You could have lived your entire life in Ephesus and seen this temple only as a work in progress. It was a promise that spanned generations. A child who saw the first new foundation stone laid could have been a grey-haired old man by the time the final massive carved marble tile was eased onto the new roof. And what a roof! It was not just a covering, it was a sky of its own. A vast coffered ceiling of carved wood so high above the marble floor that it seemed to be lost in its own self-contained dusk. The light, as before, did not flood the space. It streamed in through the hypethron, the opening to the sky. But it was different now. The space was wider, longer. The shadows were deeper. The sense of scale, once humbling, was now annihilating. This was the second wonder, birthed from the ashes of the first. It was a defiant, furious, beautiful shout carved in stone. It was the city of Ephesus, looking up at the gods, looking back at their own history of fire and ruin and saying, "You can burn it, you can break it, but we will come back, and we will build it grander." And when it was finished, when the last chisel fell silent, when the last speck of marble dust settled, the air was finally, truly clean again. It smelled only of cool stone and faint, sweet incense and the distant, salty marsh. It was perfect. The new wonder was complete. It was a promise kept, a scar erased. And now the second temple, this colossal, gleaming white mountain of defiance, began to do what it was always meant to do. It began to pull. It exerted a kind of gravity, a silent, irresistible summons that travelled across the wine-dark sea, along the dusty trade routes, and into the hearts of millions. The first temple had been a destination. This was a pilgrimage. This was a necessity. To be alive in the world and to have not seen the Artemision of Ephesus, it was to have not truly lived. And so they came in a flood. The great harbour, which smelled of salt and sun-baked tar and the sharp, briny scent of drying fish nets, was now choked with ships with broad, striped sails from Egypt, their decks piled high with papyrus and linen, heavy, round-bellied merchant ships from the coasts of Syria, the air around them thick with the scent of their cargo, exotic, sweet spices, cedar and olive oil, long, fast triremes from Greece and quinqueremes from Rome, their banners limp in the hot, damp Anatolian air. The pilgrims poured from these ships, their feet unsteady from the sea, finding the solid, warm stone of the Ephesian docks. They were a river of humanity, a low, constant, shuffling roar of voices, 1,000 different accents, 12 different languages, all trying to ask the same questions. Where is the inn? Where can I change my money? Which way? Which way to her? The city of Ephesus. It fed on this. It grew fat and rich on this single, profound human need to be in the presence of the divine. The streets leading from the harbour to the Temenos were no longer quiet avenues. They were a bustling, chaotic, vibrant bazaar. The air was thick with the smell of hot frying oil from the food stalls, the sweet, sticky scent of honey cakes, the dry, dusty smell of countless shuffling sandals, the bleating of sheep and the lowing of oxen, their horns perhaps gilded, being led to the great altar for sacrifice, added to the sound their warm animal smell, a pungent, earthy bass note under the ever-present sweet perfume of incense. Faith had become an economy, and that economy had its own sound. It was not the silent prayer of the priest or the song of the wind in the columns. It was a sound that rose from 100 workshops in the narrow, hot, smoky alleys behind the grand avenues. It was the sound of hammers. Tap, 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 tinker, tinker, tap. It was a constant, metallic, rhythmic shimmer of a sound, the sound of silver being worked. This was the true engine of the Ephesian economy. This was the workshop of Demetrius. Imagine stepping into that alley. The sun, so bright on the white marble of the main street, is almost gone here. The air is choked. It smells of the sharp, acrid, stinging bite of charcoal forge smoke. It smells of the sour metallic tang of hot silver and bronze and lead. It smells of sweat. The heat is oppressive, a dry, baking furnace heat that seems to suck the air from your lungs. And everywhere the sound, tap, tap, tap. Men, their faces black with soot, their arms and chests slick with sweat, their hands stained and strong, are bent over small wooden benches. Demetrius is one of them, a master. He is not just a smith. He is a guardian of the faith's memory. He is making souvenirs. He holds a small carved stone mould. Into it he pours a tiny, shimmering stream of molten liquid silver, hissing and spitting in the heat. He plunges it into a bucket of water. A violent hiss, a cloud of steam, and it is cool. He cracks the mould, and in his calloused, blackened palm lies a thing, a tiny, perfect silver shrine, a naos, a pocket-sized portable temple, complete with tiny columns, and inside, smaller than your fingernail, a perfect miniature multi-breasted Artemis. These were the true currency of Ephesus. Every pilgrim, every traveller, every sailor had to have one. To take home, to put on their mantle, to prove they had been, to keep a tiny piece of the goddess's magic for themselves. This was the lifeblood of Demetrius and of the guild of the silversmiths. Their lives were good, their bellies were full, their trade was as reliable as the rising of the sun. The goddess provided. Her fame was their fortune into this hot, loud, stable, wealthy, incense-filled, hammer-tapping world. A new sound arrived. It was not the roar of a legion. It was not the clink of gold. It was a voice. A single, quiet, insistent voice, speaking in the synagogue, and later in the lecture hall of Tyrannus, day after day for 2 years. The voice of a man named Paul. He was a Jew from Tarsus, a tent maker. He smelled not of incense, but of the road, of leather and camel hair and dust and endless patient, relentless walking. He did not come with offerings of silver. He came with words, and his words were a whisper that acted like a solvent. He stood in the agora, in the small, crowded, shadowy rooms, and he spoke of a different God, an invisible God, a God who had died and risen, a God who did not live in a temple, a God who could not be seen. And this was the dangerous part. This was the whisper that would light a new fire. He told them simply that gods made with hands are not gods at all. Imagine those words spoken aloud in the city of the silversmiths. Imagine that quiet, reasoned sentence drifting on the hot, smoky air into the workshop of Demetrius. Gods made with hand are not gods at all. It is not just heresy, it is bankruptcy. It is a statement that the small, silver, perfect, profitable goddess, the one sitting in his palm, is a lie. It is an idea that does not just threaten a belief, it threatens a livelihood. It threatens the entire, vast, rich, intricate economy of faith. Demetrius. He felt a chill in his hot workshop, the rhythmic, profitable tap, tap, tap of the hammers. It began to slow. He looked at his hands, he looked at his shrines, and he felt fear. The hammers stopped. The sound that replaced them was a new one. It was the sound of angry whispers, the sound of shuffling, heavy, purposeful feet. Demetrius, his voice hoarse with fear and a new righteous fury, gathered his guild. He lit the spark. This man, this Paul, he is taking away our trade. He is turning the world against our goddess. He is turning our silver to dust. The fear caught. It flared like oil on a fire. The small, angry crowd became a mob. They flooded out of the smoky alleys, their faces grim. They were not carrying hammers now, they were carrying rage. They dragged two of Paul's companions with them, and they moved, a single, roaring, many-headed beast, to the one place in the city large enough to hold their fury. The Great Theatre. Imagine it. A vast white marble bowl carved into the side of the hill. A place designed for 25,000 people. A place of perfect acoustics, where a single spoken word from the stage could be heard in the highest, farthest seat. The mob poured in. They filled the stone seats, a sea of angry, shouting, terrified faces. The hot afternoon sun beat down, the white stone reflecting a blinding, painful glare. The air, which should have smelled of the sea breeze, was now hot and close and filled with the smell of a vast, panicked, sweating crowd. And then the sound began. It was not a speech. It was not a word. It was a chant. Someone, perhaps Demetrius himself, shouted it first, a desperate, primal, territorial roar. "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Another voice picked it up, then 100, then 1,000, then 25,000. The theatre, designed for a single clear voice, became a cauldron of noise. The sound was physical. It was a vibration that you felt in your chest, in your teeth. It was a solid, deafening, hypnotic wave of sound, echoing off the massive stone stage, reinforcing itself, growing louder and louder and louder. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. For 2 hours they shouted. 2 hours. This was not the sound of faith. It was not the sound of devotion. It was the sound of fear. It was the sound of 1,000 hammers striking as one. It was the sound of an old, comfortable, wealthy world, terrified, trying to shout a new, small, quiet, persistent, world-changing whisper into silence. The new wonder, the second defiant shout of marble. It too grew old. The world that had built it, the world of Alexander, of the great competing sculptors, of the Roman Republic, that world was passing. The temple had now stood for centuries. The brilliant, sharp-edged white of its youth had softened, weathered by 1,000 damp, salty winters. The marble was now the colour of old ivory, of pale, soft honey, stained by streaks of rain. It was no longer a new defiance, it was an institution. It was the ancient, quiet, beating heart of Ephesus. The year was 268, the great Pax Romana, the Roman peace which had held the world in a warm, stable, sun-baked embrace for so long, was fraying. The air felt anxious. The borders of the empire, once so firm, were porous. The whispers this time were not of new philosophies or of jealous artists. They were of barbarians. And one day the whispers arrived. They came, as they so often did, from the sea. But they did not come in the round, familiar, full-bellied merchant ships that smelled of olives, spices, and wine. They came in long, dark, lean ships, ships with high, snarling prows like wolves. They were fast, they were silent, they were not built for trade, they were built for raiding. And the men inside them, they were not pilgrims. They did not come with coins of silver or prayers for the goddess. They did not smell of the road or of faith. They smelled of the cold northern sea, of wet, heavy wool, of pine tar and cold, hard iron, of hunger. They were the Goths. A new terror, a new name, a new kind of storm. They did not pause at the harbour. They did not negotiate in the agora. They were a wave of iron and fury, and they crashed through the city gates before the alarm could be properly sounded. The sound was not the tap of the silversmith's hammer or the chant of the theatre. It was the sharp, terrified scream of the unprepared. It was the clash of steel, the splintering of doors, the hard, guttural shouts in a language that sounded like cracking rocks. They moved as if drawn by a magnet to the greatest prize, to the Temenos. They were not awed by the beauty. They were not humbled by the scale. They were not stopped by the invisible ancient line of Assyria. That was a law of a god they did not know and did not fear. They saw a forest of marble, and they knew that, at its heart, there was gold. They stormed into the great, cool, silent forest of stone, their heavy, leather-bound feet caked in the mud and blood of the city, scraped and thudded on the polished, sacred floor. The sound was of breaking. The priests, the megabizoi, their lives spent in the dim, incense-filled calm, were cut down where they stood. The sudden, hot, coppery smell of blood on the cold, ancient, indifferent marble. The virgin priestesses, guardians of the cult, their cries were short and then silenced. This was not a riot, it was a plunder. The sound of heavy bronze-bound chests being smashed open with axes, the crash of priceless 1,000-year-old votive statues, offerings from kings and emperors, being toppled from their pedestals, shattering on the floor. The sound of the silversmith's work, the beautiful tiny silver naui, not being bought but being scraped off shelves, swept by the armful into rough, blood-stained burlap sacks, the clatter and clink and jingle of 1,000 years of wealth being stolen in a single brutal, breathless hour. They tore the ancient jewel-encrusted tapestries from the walls, the sound of that tearing like a human scream. They smashed the lamps. They violated the dark inner naos. They pulled the very idol of the goddess, the dark, wooden, multi-breasted, enigmatic ancient mother, from her pedestal. Perhaps they broke her. Perhaps they simply tossed her aside. She was wood. She was not gold. And then the fire. This was not the fire of Herostratus. That had been a single, lonely, desperate act of ego. This was casual. This was an afterthought, a final, contemptuous, brutal act of dominance. A torch, its oily black smoke smelling of crude pitch, was tossed into a pile of priceless ripped tapestries. It was thrown onto the remnants of the sacred scrolls. It was held to the base of the great carved wooden roof, and for the second, and for the last time, the wonder of the world burned. The heat once again met the cold ancient marble. The columns, 200 years older now, cracked with a sound like thunder. The roof, the magnificent, soaring, carved ceiling groaned and sagged, and then collapsed. A final, deafening, earth-shaking roar of fire and destruction. The Goths. They did not stay to watch. They were already gone, their long, dark ships now sitting heavy in the water, slipping out of the harbour, disappearing back into the mists of the sea, leaving a pillar of black, oily smoke to mark their visit. The sun rose as it always does. It rose on a ruin. The Ephesians crept from their hiding places, from the cellars, from the hills. They stood at the edge of the Temenos, and they looked. But this silence, this was not the shocked, grieving, defiant silence of the first fire. This was an empty silence, a hollowed out, exhausted and final silence. No one spoke of rebuilding. No one. The world had changed. The will was gone. The money was gone. The great, sprawling, magnificent Roman Empire was itself a burning house. It was bleeding from 1,000 cuts on 12 borders just like this one. All the gold that was left in the world was needed for spears, for armor, for legionaries, for building walls, not temples. But more than that, deeper than that, the belief was gone. The whisper of the man Paul 2 centuries before, it was no longer a whisper. It had become a roar. It was the official voice of the new emperors in their grand, cold, faraway palaces in Constantinople and Rome. The new God, the one who was not made of hands, the one who did not live in a house of stone. He had won. The people of Ephesus looked at the smoking, shattered, twice-broken stumps of the Artemision, and they felt nothing. The goddess felt old. She felt cold. She had not protected them. The magic, that potent, ancient, earthy magic, it had leached out of the stone. It had drained away like water into the marsh. The ruin was just a ruin. The final end. It was not a fire. It was not a sword. It was a pen. It was a piece of parchment carried on a ship, bearing the dry imperial seal of the Emperor Theodosius in the year 391. It was an edict, a law. It did not ask, it commanded. The old ways were over. The pagan temples, all of them, were to be closed. The sacrifices forbidden, the rituals outlawed. Imagine that. The last old tired priest of Artemis, perhaps still tending a single smoking, guttering lamp in a small, unbroken shed on the edge of the vast cold ruin. He hears the crier read the edict in the agora, and he must just go home. He must walk into the ruin, the wind whistling through the broken teeth of the columns. He must look one last time at the place that was once the center of the world, and he must pinch out the flame. A final, tiny, sad hiss, a wisp of smoke rising and vanishing into the damp, grey Ephesian air. The silence that fell over the Temenos was absolute. The sound of the wind, the sound of the rain, puddling on the cracked, ash-stained marble floor, and from the edges of the great foundation, a new, old sound, the sound of the marsh, the croak of the frogs, the rustle of the reeds, the whisper of the water, the earth held back for 1,000 years by genius and by gold and by faith, was finally, gently, patiently, and irreversibly coming back to claim its own. The last guttering lamp of the goddess was pinched out. The final, old, tired priest had walked away, his footsteps echoing for a moment in the vast, empty ruin. And then a new silence fell, a silence deeper and more profound than any that had come before. It was not the sacred silence of the inner sanctum. It was not the shocked silence of the morning after the fire. It was the silence of the grave. For a year, perhaps for a generation, the only sound was the wind, a low, hollow, mournful whistle as it played across the jagged, broken teeth of the 127 stumps. The only visitor was the rain, cold and grey, hissing as it struck the cracked, ash-stained pavement, pooling in the hollows where giants had once stood. The air was no longer sweet with incense or acrid with fire. It was just cold. It smelled of damp, mossy stone, of decay, of the sour, metallic tang of profound and total abandonment. And in that long, empty silence, the fear, the divine, ancient, powerful terror that had guarded this place for a millennium, it simply evaporated. The first man to test it, he must have been terrified. A local, perhaps, his own small house needing a foundation stone. He would have crept in, his heart a frantic drum in his chest, his eyes turned to the sky, expecting the thunderbolt. He would have brought a hammer and a heavy iron wedge. You can almost hear it, the sharp, nervous clang of iron on marble. He strikes. The sound, impossibly loud, echoes across the ruin. He waits, and nothing. No curse, no blinding light, no vengeful goddess. Only the crick of the marble as the wedge bit deep. He struck again, clang, and again, crack. He had not struck a goddess, he had struck stone. It was a quarry now. The word spread. The magic was gone. And the temple, the wonder of the world, was now just a resource, a pile of free, exquisitely carved, perfectly cut, pre-sorted building material. The Ephesians, the great-great-grandchildren of those who had wept at its burning, now came with carts. They came with oxen. They came with tools. The sound of the ruin changed. It was no longer the wind's mournful whistle. It was the sound of industry, the sound of salvage, the sharp, practical, relentless chip, chip, chip of chisels, not carving art but carving blocks, the groan of levers, the shout of workmen, the creak of wagon wheels. They were harvesting the bones of their own history. They pried up the magnificent mosaic floors. They broke apart the shattered drums of the columns. They took the steps, the architraves, the foundation blocks. The home of the goddess was carted away piece by piece to become the threshold of a new church, the wall of a bathhouse, the foundation of a merchant's villa. The wonder was recycled, dissolved back into the very city it had once protected. But the greatest of its bones, the few, vast, unbroken giants that had survived, they were destined for a different and far grander afterlife. A new power was rising, glittering in the east. Constantinople, the new golden Christian Rome, and its emperor Justinian was a man who dreamed in stone and gold. He was building a temple for his god, a temple that would not just rival the old wonders, but erase them. A dome, a vast, floating, impossible sky of gold to hang suspended over the earth, the Hagia Sophia, and he too needed a quarry. His agents, his imperial procurators, came to the sad, picked-over ruin at Ephesus. They saw not a grave, but a treasure. They saw the great green porphyry columns from the naos and the few proud 60-foot marble giants that still stubbornly stood, and they claimed them. Now a new sound, not the small chipping sound of local salvage, but the sound of imperial industrial extraction. This was the sound of 1,000 men, organized and funded and driven. The sound of massive, complex wooden cranes, their great wheels groaning like dying beasts. The shriek of ropes, thick as a man's thigh, tautening under a weight they were never meant to bear. Imagine the sound of one of those columns, one of the giants, falling, a slow, screaming wooden crash as the scaffolds took the weight, and then the deep, earth-shaking thud as it was lowered, gently onto a massive rolling sledge. The air smelled of sweat, the sharp, pungent animal smell of 100 yoked oxen, their great muscled shoulders straining, their hooves sucking at the wet, soft ground as they began to pull, the groan and creak of the massive wooden rollers, crushing the sacred broken pavement beneath them. They dragged the giants one by one like the beautiful, pale corpses of slain gods through the city, down to the harbour which was itself changing. It was shallower. The water, once so deep, was now a pale, silty, brownish green. The ships, the great imperial barges, had to wait far out, but they came. They loaded their cargo, the green columns of porphyry, the white giants of marble, and they set sail north across the Aegean toward the Bosphorus, a slow, heavy funeral procession carrying the heart of Artemis to the home of Christ. And here, in this new, vast, echoing space, they were given a new life. You can stand there today. You can walk into the Hagia Sophia. The air is different. It is not the open, airy, marsh-scented air of the Artemision. It is an enclosed, vast, cavernous air. It smells of a different, sharper incense, frankincense. It smells of the faint, waxy, honeyed scent of 1,000,000 beeswax candles burned over 1,000 years. It smells of the cool, dry dust of ages, and you can walk, and you can stop, and you can reach out your hand, and you can touch it. You can lay your small, warm, living palm against the cool, smooth, green-veined surface of the same column that once stood in the darkness of the pagan naos, the same stone that felt the heat of the Goths' fire, the same stone that heard the whisper of the megabyzoi. It stands here now, a silent, captured and repurposed giant. It is a trophy. It is a testament. It stands with its brothers, holding up the galleries, staring forever at the new, golden, shimmering mosaics of the Virgin and the Christ and the soaring, winged seraphim. It is a pagan pillar in a Christian palace, a silent, eternal, beautiful witness, its ancient, pagan, earthy secret, held fast in its cold stone heart, and back in Ephesus, back at the ruin, the quarrying too finally stopped. The scavengers, the emperors, they had taken all they could. What was left? What was untakeable? The foundation, the broken stumps, the vast, empty, waterlogged footprint, and now the true, final, and patient victor of this long, long story began its work. It was not a man. It was not a god. It was the river, the Kaistros. For centuries it had been trying, the little meandering, lazy brown river. It had always carried in its slow, gentle current the earth, the silt from the Anatolian hills. For 1,000 years the Ephesians had fought it, dredging the harbour, building canals, holding it back. But now, no one fought it. The empire was busy. The city was shrinking. The will was gone. And so the river won. It came not in a flood, but in a whisper. Every winter a little higher, every spring a little slower. It began to choke the great proud harbour, the harbour that had welcomed the world, turning it from a deep blue water port into a reedy, shallow, impassable swamp, and it began to creep with its slow, brown, gentle fingers into the Temenos. It did not come with a roar. It came with a hiss, the sound of slow-moving water and mud, the sound of silting. Year after year the winter flood would come. The brown, fertile, muddy water would pour into the great, hollow, quarried-out foundation of the temple. It would swirl gently around the broken, blackened stumps, and then In the spring it would recede, leaving behind a blanket, a thin grey-brown, fertile, silken layer of mud. The next year another, and another, and another. You can almost smell it, the rich, thick, primal scent of the wet earth, the sharp green smell of the reeds taking root inside the temple, the air filled with the sound of the marsh, a sound that had been held at bay for a millennium, the deep, throbbing croak of the frogs, the rustle of the water snakes, the whir of the dragonflies, the silt rose, foot by foot, generation by generation. It covered the cracked pavement, it covered the bases of the broken columns, it slowly, gently buried the great black, fire-stained stumps, it covered the charcoal, it covered the fleece, it covered the memory. The earth was reclaiming its own. The temple, the wonder, the defiance was simply, quietly, and gently put to sleep. It was tucked in under a vast, soft, wet, 20-foot deep blanket of brown, fertile, indifferent mud. The Temple of Artemis did not just die, it disappeared, and so the temple, the wonder, the grave lay silent. It slept for 1,000 years, and then for 500 more. It slept, buried under its soft, deep, 20-foot thick blanket of brown, fertile river silt. The world forgot it completely. Ephesus itself, the great white marble city, it too was a ruin, a ghost of a city, haunted by the wind, picked over by scavengers. But you could see the city, you could walk its broken marble-paved roads, you could stand in the vast, silent, crumbling bowl of the great theatre, you could touch the beautiful carved facade of the Library of Celsus. The city was a skeleton, but the temple was gone. It was not a skeleton, it was dust. It had vanished, not just from sight, but from geography. It had been swallowed. The place where the wonder of the world had stood was now just a field, a flat, green, empty, useless, waterlogged marsh. The air smelled only of the marsh, the sweet, damp green smell of reeds, the sour, sulphurous smell of standing water. The only sound was the deep, endless, throbbing croak of the frogs and the high, thin, incessant whine of the mosquito. It was a place of fever, a place to be avoided. The local farmers, tending their crops on the drier land nearby, would not go there. And yet, the whispers remained, not in the marsh, but in the books, the old, dry, fragile books, their parchments smelling of dust and time. Pliny had written of it. Antipater of Sidon had sung of it. The old words, the old breathless descriptions of the forest of marble, the house of the goddess. They all survived. And in the 19th century, a man, an Englishman, read them. His name was John Turtlewood. He was an architect, not an adventurer, a practical man, sent to Turkey to build railway stations. But he read the old words, and he believed. He stood, perhaps, in the ruins of the theatre. He felt the hot, damp Anatolian sun on his tweed coat. He smelled the dust and the wild thyme and the distant wet marsh. And he was gripped by a kind quiet, profound, and total obsession. He knew, with a certainty that was beyond logic, that it was out there, under the reeds, under the water, under the mud. He called it the archaeologist's dream. To others it was Wood's folly. He began to search. In the year 1863, with a small, sceptical, meagre grant from the British Museum in London, you can almost smell the air of those London offices, the scent of old paper, floor wax, and coal smoke, as they read his hopeful, desperate letters from the field. And for 6 years he found nothing. Imagine the despair. Imagine the work. This was not a clean, dry, romantic excavation. This was a war against the marsh. The sound of his work was not the delicate brush of the archaeologist. It was the heavy, wet, soul-destroying suck, thud, and squish of spades, digging into an endless, brown, wet, hostile, empty mud. The air was thick with the stink of the opened earth, a sour, ancient, vegetal smell of 1,000 years of rot. The men, his workers, were sick with fever, their hands raw, their spirits broken. The mosquitoes, rising in black, whining clouds, were a constant, tormenting plague. And every trench he dug, every deep, hopeful, rectangular wound he carved into the earth, filled almost instantly with a seeping, brown, mocking water. He was digging in a swamp, searching for a ghost. 6 years. The money was running out. The museum was losing patience. His dream was dying, drowning in the mud. He had found Roman baths. He had found Byzantine walls. He had found nothing of the wonder. And then, on the last day of December in 1869, another day of failure. The air was cold, the sky a flat grey wintry lid. The spades suck, thud, squish, clink. A sound, a new sound, a sound that did not belong. Not the thud of mud, not the squish of reeds. A hard, sharp, scraping sound, a sound of intention. The world stopped, the digging stopped, the foreman shouted. Wood himself perhaps scrambled down into the wet, cold, muddy trench. his heart a frantic, sudden, painful drum in his chest. His hands, raw and caked, clawed at the muck. He felt it. Not a rock, not a root. Stone, cut stone, a pavement. He had not found the temple. He had found the line, the peribolous wall, the sacred boundary buried 20 feet beneath the mud of the modern world. And now the digging was not hopeless. It was frantic. They followed the stone. They followed the line. It was a map left for them by the ancients buried in the dark, and it led them deeper into the swamp to the place, to the true place. And there, down in the cold, wet, dark 20 trench lit by lanterns, his spade, it hit it, the foundation, the massive, sprawling, impossible floor of the wonder of the world. He was standing 20 feet below the grass, on the same cracked, blackened, fire-stained pavement that had once felt the thud of the Goths' axes. He touched the shattered, colossal, burnt base of one of the columns. He had found it. He had found the grave. He had touched the bones. The air at the bottom of that pit was the first air to touch that stone in 1500 years. It was the air of a tomb just opened, and it was the air of his dream, finally, impossibly, made real. Today, you can go there. You can stand where he stood, and you will see almost nothing. The Marsh has truly won. The excavation is a hole, a vast rectangular, waterlogged footprint filled with reeds and brown water and the endless throbbing ancient croak of the frogs. The air as it was, as it will always be, smells of wet earth and growing things and the damp. It is an absence, but it is not empty, because in the middle of that vast, wet, green, indifferent field, one thing, one single, lonely thing rises. It is a column. It is not an original. It is not one of the green, captured giants living its second life in Istanbul. It is a reconstruction, a composite, a thing of concrete and steel, clad in the few shattered, broken, tragic drums, the pieces of the fallen giants. That Wood and the archaeologists who came after him found, drowned in the mud. It is 60 feet high. It is not as beautiful. It is not as perfect. It is jagged and patched and incomplete. But it stands. It stands, a single defiant vertical line in a world of horizontal water and earth. It is a marker. It is a gravestone. It is the final, stubborn, impossible word in a story that should have ended 1,000 years ago. It is the whisper of Chersiphron's genius. It is the echo of Croesus's gold. It is the shadow of Herostratus's fire. It is the memory of Alexander's ambition. It is the scar of the Goths' fury. It is the ghost of Justinian's plunder. It is the monument to John Turtlewood's mad, beautiful, unshakable dream. It stands there, alone, the first wonder and the last, holding its watch in the middle of the whispering marsh. And so, the last pillar crumbled into memory. We close the heavy marble cover. The story is finished. The whispers of Ephesus are quiet once more. You can let go now. The book is closed, and it is time for you to sleep. You are safe here in the warmth of the library. The fire is low, the candles are burning down, and you are so very heavy. There is nothing left to do, nothing to see, only the comfortable darkness and the sound of my voice. If you wish to return to the library, if you wish to find another story waiting for you tomorrow night, just whisper a quiet subscribe. We will keep a candle lit for you, and as you drift away, as you float on that gentle wave of sleep, perhaps you can let me know, where are you from? What distant land are you listening from tonight? Leave a whisper below, so I know how far our stories travel, but that is for tomorrow. For now, sleep, sleep. The library is watching over you. Good night, good night, good night.